Today we're going to have a look at the 5 major chord shapes of the CAGED system. We're also going to have a look at how we can maximise them so that they become much, much more. Today we're going to be playing a series of G chords utilising the CAGED system. Now we're going to start off using the E shape of the CAGED system. Now if we have a look at an E chord, just to familiarise ourselves with it, it looks like this. So first thing to note is where the root note is, and the root note for this chord happens to be on the open E string, on the thick E string at the top. And the other to note is just the general pattern and direction of the rest of my fingers. They tend to fall after the root note and they've got this little shape in the middle. Now to turn this into a G chord using this shape, what we need to do is move this shape consistently up the neck until we find that we land on a G note on the root. So my root note is up here, up on this E string. I need to move my fingers across consistently until this root note falls on a G note. And that would give me a G chord. Now the only issue I have at the moment is that obviously I can't play guitar with where my hands are at the moment. So what we need to do is just to readjust our fingers so that we can make the rest of the shapes. I can hold it all down with one hand. And what I'd end up with is this shape here. Okay, which you might recognise as a bar chord shape. You may even recognise this as an F shape, as that's one of the chords that often people learn when they're new to the instrument. But this is in fact an E shape. All I've done is taken my E chord, I've just switched my fingers around and moved it consistently up the neck until I find my root note is a G note. Now that's all good and proper, but before we move on to the next chord, what we really want to do is maximise this shape in particular, and the same with the rest of the shapes, so that it becomes much, much more. And the way we do this is we fragment the chords. So we take this whole shape, but we break it down into lots of mini little chords within it, and what you get is some interesting voicings, inversions, and different stylistic options. So quite simply, and you can chop this up however you like really, I'm going to start off from the thinner strings. If I just take the last 2 notes within this chord shape, the B and the E string, I could just play these just like that. I don't necessarily have to play the whole shape. This is still a G chord. In particular, it's a power chord, is what I'm getting here. Now this particular shape and voicer is very kind of popular with those kind of rock and roll type songs. And it's a nice little cool thing to play around with. If I add in another string, add in the G string, I get this shape. Which is very useful for ska and reggae. It starts on the 3rd interval. You could think of this as first inversion of a G major chord, but ultimately it's still built from this whole shape. I've just taken a certain fragment of it to give myself something very different sounding, and it's still a G chord. If I add on the D string as well, I get this particular shape. This is very popular with Jimi Hendrix. He used to love using this shape. He used his thumb over the top as well, which gave him a little bass note to play because he did a lot of kind of chord melody style playing. And you got the little finger free to have a kind of melody note. So really useful shape to play, but it's still a G chord and it's still built from that big E shape that we're using. We could add in the next string, and you've basically got almost all the bar chord. We're just muting off the thick E string on the top, favoured by a lot of classic rock guitarists, and that's why I'm playing that big bar chord. And of course we can go the other way and use just the thicker strings. And you'll notice that's where we get the power chords. Now you can use any combinations of notes within this shape, but it gives you lots of options. And the great thing about that is if you want to be creative, you really need to think about, well, where do I want to play my notes? Yes, I want to play a G chord, but where in the register do I want to play them? Do I want to play inversions? What type of dynamic do I want to get? And with that one shape, you get many, many options. And that's what I'd like you to do with the rest of the chord shapes as well, is break them apart and see how many options you can get. And then you'll have a whole array of tools that you can use when you need to play a major chord in your song without just being stuck thinking, well, I've got to play a G chord, so that's my only option. Let's move on throughout the system. So that was our E shape, okay, based on the E open shape. I made it into a G chord just by taking everything consistently up with that E shape and starting it on a G note on the root. Next we're going to look at the D shape. Now if we look at a D shape normally, it looks like this. The root note is on the open D string, so I'm not actually holding it down, and the rest of the fingers fall in this pattern after it in a directional sense. all I'm going to do is move it consistently up the neck until I land on a G note on that D string. And that gives me a G chord up on the neck. And again, I'm just going to have to rearrange my fingers. You may notice I'm talking this quite quickly because I want to get through this in a reasonably short video, but do hit the pause button, look at the pictures to help you. Now, in terms of holding down this whole shape, it looks like this, which is my D shape. You can see the little D pattern down here, and this finger's holding down what would have been the open string. Personally, I find this a little bit awkward. If you're going to hold it down, the easiest way to do it, I think, is to place down your second finger on the G string, third finger on the E string, and then use that as a pivot to kind of twist around into the rest of the chord shape. And you get your D shape, which in this case is a G chord. Now that's reasonably awkward. You can play it like that, but again, we're looking to fragment these things and get different options. And probably the obvious solution here is just to play your normal little D shape with the three fingers and just mute off this D string. And that gives you a major chord shape, a G in this instance. The root note's up here, even though I'm not playing it. And that's a really useful shape and very easy to do because you would have learnt playing that pattern before. You just move it into different places. And again, you can fragment this up different ways. You've got power chords within the D shape. You can even play octaves. Whatever you want to do, depending on your situation. Next, of course, is going to be a C shape. Now, a C shape looks like this. Root note is on the A string, and the rest of the notes kind of tail off behind it in this pattern. Again, we just want to kind of move this up the guitar so that root note drops onto a G note, which is one up there, and it's kind of over here. And again, we've just got to adjust the finger so that we can do that. There's different ways of doing it. Personally, I just like to bar the first finger down and add in the rest of the shape. And here we have, again, a G chord, in this instance, using the C shape. With that root note up here on the A string, everything turned off behind it. Now again, this chord shape, it's not too tricky, but it's a little bit tricky if you don't play it very often. People do use the whole shape, but again, we can fragment it into different things. One thing which is really cool about this shape is if you take the last three strings, you actually get the same little shape that you did with the D. So if you play on this shape, you could think of this as a C shape, you could think of it as a D shape. It doesn't really matter. I suppose if you're tying it into chords and the side of it you play for a certain note, it might make you think in certain ways. But ultimately it's up to you, whatever helps you visualise what you're doing. But that's quite cool. You can of course play the bass notes and you get this nice little pattern. But one real cool trick, you'll see a lot of classic rock and funk guitarists using this shape for the C. And I'm playing the D string, the G string, and the B string of the shape here. I might, if I'm lucky, get in the E string, but I'm not really trying to. So we're just omitting the root note there on the A string. Now you might think, well, why would I use that? But actually this is used quite a lot. Because it tails off into another chord shape that you can use behind it, which again is very, very useful. Also, if I play the whole shape again, if I just remove my little finger, I get a minor 7 chord. So again, a useful little chord change if you want to go between major and minor relatives. So a very, very useful shape, the C shape, even if it's a little bit tricky to play the whole thing. Next one along, again, we just work through the spelling of CAGED. After C, we'll get an A shape. Now, I'm a rock guitarist predominantly, so I would usually play an A chord with a bar shape, usually muting off the thin E string at the bottom, which is fine, and we're going to use that, but you may be familiar with playing it as more of an open chord, like this, to include that open E at the bottom. It doesn't really matter. What we're going to do is we're going to move that whole shape again, so that the root note, which is on the A string, and the rest of the pattern which falls after it, again is consistent, but starting up on our G note up here. So I found a G note on the A string, and I'm just going to apply that A shape, and I'll get this. Which again is probably a chord shape you may be familiar with, especially if you learn B chords at some point. Again, a very useful shape, and you can see we've got our power chord right at the top of it. It's quite easy actually to play this whole shape, so you probably would use that quite a lot. You could just take the last few strings, Again, you've got those nice bright voicings, you get a very clear, harsh dynamic of those strings. Very useful for playing like funk and again with reggae and ska and that kind of thing. But again, the useful thing about this one is there's also a very easy shape within it, and you can just play the D, G and B strings with one finger. It doesn't matter which finger you're using, it kind of depends what you're doing before and afterwards. But it's very easy to just play one finger and obviously get the major chord that you want, obviously knowing that your root note is back here upon the A string. And if, bear in mind what I just said with the C shape, where you can play it like that, C shape to an A shape, and you've got, again, different options for changing between chords. Moving swiftly on, because again, trying to keep this nice and short, we then next have the G shape. Now, generally speaking, I play a G shape like this, which again is kind of like the rock guitarist way of doing it, with the two fingers at the bottom. If you remove your third finger, quite often you'll see this G shape when you're looking in a lot of the books. It includes the open B string, which is a major third, which is a really useful note. So we're going to use this pattern moving at the neck, but you can use both. Again, it doesn't really matter, it depends what you're trying to achieve. But we've got to move this all the way up the neck, and I want to start on a G note. Now I know we're already on a G note because I play an open G shape, but for the purpose of moving it across the neck, you'll see what I mean. So if I take this all the way up, so I find another G note, so I'm no longer using the other shapes, well that's a long way up the neck to play this particular one, and it would be these notes here. Now to play that's reasonably awkward, I'm going to say. I actually find the shape a lot easier if you turn the guitar slightly sideways. It gives you better access to make that sort of stretch with your fingers. The chances of you playing this very often are slim. You know, you're probably not going to want to go to that much effort. You might do, but it's unlikely. So again, you're more likely to fragment this chord into smaller shapes. You can, of course, play the thick notes. You can choose the one finger, which again, you might think of as an A shape. You could think of that as a G shape. Again, it kind of depends on where you want to position the things that you're doing around it. But really nicely about this particular, I really like this voicing because if you just play the last three strings, you get that sound, and that's really, really easy to play. So whilst the G shape sometimes might be considered as the hardest place, when you fragment it, it could be the easiest place to play. And again, if you're familiar with your scales and things, it fits into this position, which is a shape that a lot of people learn early, so there's a lot of familiarity around that place. Good job I can catch my pick on my leg. So there we have it, we have five shapes. Okay, we have the E shape I just played, the D shape, we have a C shape, an A shape, and a G shape, but we don't have to play that. Okay, there's always little mini kind of shapes inside. Give ourselves lots of different creative options. So take that away, learn the individual chord shapes, and look to see how you can break out them a little bit by just using certain fragments of it. You'll find, depending on the styles you play, you might sort of use some more than others, and that's absolutely fine, and you'll maximise them in that area, link them in with scales and arpeggios, and you come up with some quite interesting things. But there's a lot of room for exploration there. The nice thing about this, these are just the major chords. You should do the same with the minor chords. But because we're just using sort of triad theory here, just the underlying major and minor intervals within these chords are 1, 3 and 5. This stuff also applies, major chords at least, to a dominant 7th chord. You can always play these major shapes underneath a dominant 7th chord, and equally a major 7th chord as well. So you get a lot of value for your money with this type of stuff. You don't have to learn something new every time you learn a new chord type. It's only really embellishing it a little bit. So I'll stop there. I hope you found that useful. Do stick around, watch some of the other videos in this series and some other guitarists, of course. Please do drop a like, comment and subscribe if you haven't subscribed before. And I shall see you soon. Thanks very much for watching.